It's a remarkable scene playing out in Washington right now and the renewed debate in this country over the efficacy and morality of torture. It's been set off by the Senate Intelligence Committee's release of its searing report on the CIA detention and interrogation program. And in a rare move for the head of such a secretive agency, CIA Director John Brennan today gave a press conference responding to the report and answering reporters' questions. And he criticized the approach taken by the Intelligence Committee's Democratic leadership.
We gave the committee our full support, providing an unprecedented amount of sensitive CIA documents to the committee and devoting considerable resources to help it with its review. Unfortunately, the committee could not agree on a bipartisan way forward, and no CIA personnel were interviewed by the committee during the course of the investigation.
All right, so this report has already been the subject of what really can only be described as an all-out war between the Senate Intelligence Committee and the CIA, to the point where the CIA accused committee staff of removing classified documents from an agency facility, and CIA agents actually hacked into Senate computers being used for the investigation. That means they spied on the legislative body charged with overseeing them. And both of those incidents were referred to the Justice Department. That's how nasty it got. Now think about for a second how messy the battle lines are in this ongoing war. On one side, you've got a report released by Democrats on the Senate committee condemning torture authorized and carried out by the Republican administration of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. On the opposing side, defending some of that administration's policies, you've got the CIA director, John Brennan, an appointee and close advisor to a Democratic president, Barack Obama. To confuse those allegiances even more, when Brennan took the microphone today, he really sounded more like Dick Cheney than he sounded like Barack Obama, starting his statement by invoking 9/11.
It was 8:46 a.m. on the morning of September 11th, 2001, when the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City was struck by an aircraft commandeered by al-Qaeda terrorists. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, our nation ached, it cried, and it prayed. And in our pain, we pledged to come together as one and to do what we could to prevent Osama bin Laden and his killing machine from ever carrying out another attack against our beautiful country.
Brennan acknowledged errors in the agency's detention and interrogation program, blaming them on a few individuals who used unapproved tactics.
In a limited number of cases, agency officers used interrogation techniques that had not been authorized, were abhorrent, and rightly should be repudiated by all. And we fell short when it came to holding some officers accountable for their mistakes.
While he stated unequivocally he supports President Obama's decision to prohibit what the CIA euphemistically insists on calling enhanced interrogation techniques, or today's acronym EITs, Brennan refused to call those techniques torture, and he rejected the report's conclusion they did not produce any actionable intelligence.
Detainees who were subjected to EITs at some point during their confinement subsequently provided information that our experts found to be useful and valuable in our counterterrorism efforts. Again, the cause and effect relationship between the application of those EITs and the ultimate provision of the information is unknown and unknowable. But for someone to say that there was no intelligence of value, of use, that came from those detainees once they were subjected to EITs, I think that lacks any foundation at all.
Interestingly, that position is actually shared by the Obama administration, despite some tough talk from President Obama on torture in the past.
The president's view is that it is impossible for anyone to know whether or not the use of an enhanced interrogation technique was necessary to obtain a specific piece of information, precisely because it's impossible to know whether or not you could have obtained that piece of information through other means.
You'll notice that's the spokesperson for the Obama White House using the term enhanced interrogation technique. Now, that's not likely to sit well with Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's the current chair of the Intelligence Committee. In fact, she spearheaded the report, and she was live tweeting point-by-point rebuttals during Brennan's remarks, including this one, quote, "No evidence that terror attacks were stopped, terrorists captured, or lives saved through the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. Hashtag read the report." I spoke to Glenn Carl, 23-year veteran of the CIA's clandestine services, who worked in the enhanced interrogation program, and I asked him what his reaction was to Brennan's performance today.
I think performance is maybe a little unfair characterization. John had, whom I know very well and have a great deal of respect for, actually, he's a friend and someone I value as a colleague, had a number of constituencies he had to try to help. Of course, he doesn't want to see his employees demoralized and punished for things that they tried to do right. He doesn't want to associate himself with things that went wrong. He doesn't want to pass the buck, or maybe he does, but he doesn't want to pass the buck to the political administration that was in power at the time, because that's even more sensitive. So I think on the whole, he, while speaking carefully, acknowledged the facts in the Senate report, which is that the program was a failure, it was wrong, it was torture, and we didn't get that right, but we are now coming out. And I do know that John opposed these things personally himself, and as he said.
Well, that was not, I got to say, as someone who's doesn't have the background and history you do of being at Langley, of being in the CIA, of having the kind of institutional outlook of the agency, for someone in the general public, it looked like someone who was defending the agency. I mean, it seemed like that to me was the constituency that was front and center in that speech, more than whatever other constituency considerations there were, which came a very distant second and third.
Well, I don't know if a very distant second and third, but certainly I agree that he was out to defend the agencies. No question about that. And he felt very obviously very ill at ease and didn't want to use the word torture. And that's in line, actually. It might be wrong, you could argue, but it's in line with the CIA culture that I knew. The word torture was never used. One couldn't bring oneself to say that. It was beyond imagination that Americans would do this, and so you came up with all of these euphemisms. That's in keeping with the culture. He did acknowledge that these things were wrong, which was positive, but he avoided the bald statements. I think probably also, not for a cultural reason, but because he is trying to protect people he thinks attempted to act honorably with hideous guidance, and not to use a word and characterizations that could create even more problems for the people down the line.
It was striking to me how much in the Brennan statement and in the fallout from this, the CIA and the folks around the CIA and people who were speaking off the record and on the record really view themselves as kind of victims in this, embattled, hung out to dry, betrayed by the political leadership. And that is not a new sentiment in the agency. I mean, it's been my sense the agency often, and if not always, feels that way.
Yeah, well, I think often that's true, and I know for a fact, and it's not surprising, you've just put your finger on it, and it's happened over and over. When, after 9/11, when the administration said, you have these detainees, get the information from them, Jim Pavitt, who was at the time the head of the clandestine services, and I believe George Tenet, were quite clear in going back to the White House and saying, we are always the ones who take the fall. We're here to do the hard jobs, but we will not act unless we have clear guidance on what is legal. And the response was, which I think was from the Office of Vice President, though I don't know that for personal fact, firsthand fact, said, of course, and went to the political hack John Yoo, who came up with the torture memorandum. Then you had this political legal cover. Right. Now, the torture memorandum is outrageous, and it has nothing to do, it totally contradicts all of American heritage and jurisprudence, and in fact, all the Western heritage. But that was the cover. And from there, things spun down. Now, what's implicit in your comment is very important, which is, okay, you might have political cover, but you also are obliged to uphold the meaning of your oath. That's the dilemma that I faced. And when the torture memo contradicted blatantly with our regulations and our laws. But it's a hard moment to face when you're the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel with the weight of the government against you. And unfortunately, many people got it wrong.
Glenn Carl, it's really it's been a pleasure to talk to you the last few nights. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'm going to talk to two of the biggest names in human rights advocacy about what comes next. Next.